Sure what to do with this. There's a temptation to start twirling it. There's also a temptation to start hitting people over the head with it. So this is the final panel of the day. We're going to be focused on strengthening and streamlining regulatory oversight. And there's always a problem being, number one, the final panel of the day. Number two, not only the final panel of the day, but the panel that immediately precedes the lunch. Third of all, a panel that's then scheduled during the lunch hour itself. And then finally, fourth, a panel which is already 10 minutes behind because of how long all of the other panels went. But the one nice thing about this panel are the panelists, which I think is the reason why everybody is staying in the room at this particular point in time. And to address the questions that we're going to be looking at, we have Felicia Marcus, who's a member of the State Water Resources Control Board. We have Greg Gartrell, who's the Assistant General Manager of the Contra Costa Water District. We have Chuck Bonham, who's the director, and I always have to get this right today, of the State Department of Fish and Wildlife. And then finally we have Tim Quinn, who's the executive director of the Association of California Water Agencies. So I want to start out by asking a question of Felicia. In particular, this is a report on multiple stressors. And so far today, we've been talking about integration of the management of those multiple stressors. But of course, integrating the management suggests that we're actually addressing all of the major stressors today. We've spent a lot of time over the last several decades focused on water exports through the, both the federal and the state water quality programs. We spent a lot of time focused on point sources of pollution. But if you look at the various things that the scientists tell us in the report we need to be addressing, there are also various stressors that we have spent less time or a less effective means of addressing, and that includes things such as upstream diversions, agricultural and urban runoff, habitat loss and disruption, and a little bit lower on the scientists' list of things that we should actually be focused on at the moment, also prevention and control of invasive species. So my question for you, Felicia, is there a reason to believe that we're going to be doing more and a more effective job of regulating that full panoply of stressors in the future? And because, having talked to you earlier, I know that one of your answers is going to be, actually, there's a lot of reason to believe we're going to be doing better because we're already doing it, is where are the areas that you see weakness still going forward that we really need to focus even more attention on?
Fair question. I think to start, I mean, one of the interesting questions implicit in it is that we haven't gotten to all of these not other stressors, but all of the multiple stressors in some way for some reason that's not obvious. And I think part of it is that dealing with a lot of these stressors, and I'll talk about them there in the report, is that it's hard. That's a short answer. It's hard, and we were focused, as you said, on other things. It's a question of priority, so people deal with things that are more obvious. And so from the contaminant side of the world, we've spent a lot of time dealing with point sources, whether sewage treatment plants or industrial facilities and the like, and we're just getting to some of the harder issues, which are not pick a particular facility that happens to be belching a lot of something as a part of what they do into the commons, as it were, into a water body, but dealing with diffuse sources that are the result of people doing things in manners that were appropriate at the time, but that we realize now really hasn't been good, or it's the remaining problem that's contaminating our waterways, for example. So the two examples that you talk about are urban stormwater and irrigated agriculture, and we are definitely engaged at the moment. So I think the trick isn't whether there's one that's going to be left out, it's just that we have harder choices to make in trying to figure out, A, how to work, as Mark was saying, how to work with the affected public and how to really come up with the right public policy levers. So, and I think that's true across the issues. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about each of those, and then I'll close with where I think the holes might be, although I don't think there are giant holes. I just think there's a lot of work that we have to get through in front of us. And
tiny pinpoints? Rather than big holes, tiny pinpoints?
Tiny pinpoints, that's right. I have to think about the right fabric. Holes in a tapestry that's kind of big weave. No, that won't work. Let me get back to you on the metaphor. The first one that you all talked about a bit is the issue of upstream diversion. I mean, one of the interesting things in listening to the panelists today about some of the efforts going on is that we didn't really talk about, no one really talked about the water quality control plans and program of implementation, maybe because that's a really long title for what it is the Water Board does, but there is a history of water quality control planning and programs of implementation that do talk about multiple stressors. They haven't necessarily been effective or implemented, and I think that's the challenge that we're going to have to deal with, where we've pointed out things that are both within our realm of responsibility, such as contaminants, or in others' realm of responsibility, such as predation or habitat. And in the one we're doing now, we're really trying to focus on all of those, including upstream tributaries. One of the things you pointed out is that we hadn't done that so much, and it's really simply because our process, because it does involve very complex water rights, we can come up with a perfect plan, and obviously we'll strive for perfection in the plans that we're doing now for the San Joaquin and the South Delta and the rest of the Bay Delta proper and the Sacramento. But in order to implement it, we have to apply water rights law, which you know better than anyone is very complicated and can take many years. So historically, we have hoped for and then approved settlements. And so in the past, where we might have had to go through and allocate responsibility and go up the trib, either the Bureau of Reclamation or some group have come up with some sort of a settlement or offer that we've taken. And this time, we're going to need to really be thinking about it, because fish obviously do need things on the upper tribs. And we're in that process, and I can't tell you what we're going to do because it's a full-on process. And even if I thought I knew, it would be pre-decisional. But we are fully enmeshed in a process that will be, is very robust and will be very robust over the next couple of years, and has involved, as many of the people in the room have been aware, days and days of sessions on science, and we'll have more sessions on science to try and figure out what the most important things to do. But basically hard, but we are actually engaged, which I think is great. On the contaminant side, and again, from my perspective, having been at EPA, and then actually before that having been a regulated entity, who no one really understands regulation quite as much as someone who has a permit and is regulated. You look at it in a lot of different lights. I then left for around 10 years from the specific regulatory world, and maybe a little less because being on the Delta Council brought me back in. I'm amazed at how much has happened on the contaminant side and how much is in process. And obviously as an old EPAer, I always bristle that no one mentions the Iron Mountain mine cleanup that removed 98% of the acute toxicity going into the upper Sacramento. That was huge. And then obviously the other more recent big one is the Sac Regional Treatment Plant orders that the regional board issued, and we confirmed, did them a slightly different way, and we now have a settlement that the nitrogen removal is happening. That is an enormous removal of contaminants. The other things, whether it's work that DPR has been doing on pesticides or our work at the regional boards on irrigated lands, or at the state board and the regional boards on urban stormwater, are well enmeshed. They're in process. There will be appeals. There will be a process, but you will see over the course of the next decade a tremendous reduction in contaminants from those challenging sources. So that, I think, are they perfect? No, but very much in process. Physical habitat disturbance is one that is particularly challenging for us, but you see the efforts at the Delta Council within Fish and Wildlife that Chuck can talk about better than I can, and also the attempt in the BDCP to vastly expand the amount of habitat which fish also need. So we're watching that with bated breath as we look at the things under our control and flow. which is also incredibly important both in and of itself and in relationship to the stressors, so it's of a piece. And so that's the one where I think that's takes a lot of money, it's very challenging, but I'm optimistic because of the work that's happened on using flood bypasses for habitat and the like. So there's a whole suite of things happening. There's obviously more than that. I don't know that anyone here wants to hear about our aquatic pesticide permit, but I'm happy to talk about it if people do want to talk about that, or are issuing a rule on contaminants of emerging concern in aquatic environments that deals with things like endocrine disruptors and caffeine and the like. I mean, we are in process on that too. So I'm optimistic in part because when I left, I was so discouraged that I left. And it's been nice to come back into the water world and see, maybe perhaps from a perspective of having been gone and coming back, that things are actually in motion, and no one's more delighted than I am that so many things are in motion at the water board.
So a follow-up question then, if you take those 3 stressors, and I noticed you didn't really mention invasives.
Oh, I forgot. Yeah, I know we have regs on ballast water, but that's a hard one.
Yeah,
that probably is the most thorny issue.
Yeah. Right. So say take those 4. So how would you grade the current oversight of those 4 stressors, combining state and federal efforts?
Yeah, I think, well, it's hard because so much of it is in process rather than done, so it kind of depends. If I'm given sort of a midterm grade, it's pretty high.
And it has to be a letter grade.
I'm going to give it a B, which is, I think, pretty good. But again, it's all about expectations. And then I think it's going to be even better, but it's going to take a few years to work its way through the system.
So Greg and Chuck and Tim, would you agree that sort of a B in terms of the way in which the state is dealing with these other stressors?
Buzz, I think we can do better. I know you're a tough grader. Having spoken to former students of yours. And I would just observe it's possible that some folks are staying in the room because ultimately they need a permit from either me or Felicia and they don't want to offend us.
I took notes on who was here. That's why I sat in the back.
To me, the question can be approached with a focus on invasives, but it could also be flipped to an area where I think we can do dramatically better. And in my mind, salmon are a good surrogate for what I want to say. You know, I don't think a successful Bay Delta conservation plan alone will recover or conserve salmon species in the Central Valley, just like I don't think a Delta plan alone or a water board proceeding alone will achieve it. And we need each of those to go well, but frankly, I've also got to go into the upper Sacramento Valley and have a productive, collaborative conversation with water users. I think we need to do the same thing with water managers in the tributaries to the San Joaquin. We need to restore the San Joaquin River restoration effort. It's likely we'll need to put some fish above main stem dams, but only after a lot more thought and testing. It's the combination of all those factors that get us to healthy populations. And the rub is none of that necessary comprehensiveness is found in any one venue, proceeding, or department. And that's where we can take a B, redouble our effort and shoot for an A on the overarching strategy within our administration, and then piece together that tapestry Felicia was talking about.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think a B is a result of grade inflation.
I just thought it was
prominent everywhere. Why not in state government?
I want to pick up on a couple of themes. I basically agree with what I've heard, although the water community has been pleading for 20 years to get to an integrated approach because we felt like our stressor had much too much stress on it. So we've been pleased to see the progress that's happening. One word of caution, though, I don't think you solve this problem by extending regulatory authority to things where they don't exist today. I mean, the problem we've got today is we try to solve the problem too much with our existing regulatory authority, and it's not the right tool. And you need to use that. You have the power not to solve the problem. You've got the power to generate a lot of economic harm. And that power can leverage everybody else to come to that collaborative table that I think both these regulators want to see happen. But these things are going to happen through a business relationship, a collaborative relationship. It's too complex, it's too comprehensive, there's too many moving parts, you can't regulate it. You have got to find a way to change the relative cultures, and I see that happening every day, not fast enough, but it's happening every day. But where people do what Mark Cowan was talking about, buy into each other's success, rather than figure out how to game the situation so you win and the other guy winds up with less marbles than he started the game with. So I think this is real important. We're not making enough progress now. I'm encouraged that the direction of things are going in, but you're not going to get there with anybody's regulatory clout. You're going to have to do what Phil argued was the impossible and get people to actually collaborate in ways that they haven't in the past, which Mom raised me to be an optimist, and I believe we can do that.
So Felicia, I see you nodding your head to Tim. So does that mean you agree?
Yeah, I mean, it's not, I agree that it's not all in the regulation, and I think that, I also think it requires people rising to the occasion, and again, just from having been gone and coming back, I do see all these, I'm not going to use the brilliant points of light, but I do see, well, I just did, so I guess I am, that I just see through the integrated water management planning process, through what's happening in Southern California, I just see people all over the place rising to an occasion of figuring out how to look at multiple benefits with scarce water resources that cuts across the water itself and includes habitat or green space in the urban context, flood control, water quality, water supply, and I think a piece of it is figuring out how we also encourage more of those efforts, which make, I just feel like there's an imperative where there are a lot of people both in and out of government who actually want to see things solved and are trying to help solve a problem. I think the problem from the, I would say, and you know that I'm not a diehard regulator, but I do think there's a role for regulation and government entities because it does sharpen the mind. And it does bring people to the table. I think the trick for some of us sometimes, and at EPA we were frequently the 800-pound gorilla, as you recall, because EPA needed to step in to set the water quality standards for the state back in the early 90s, which then leveraged getting a state plan and rallying the stakeholders and others at the state level to come up with a plan that we could approve in part out of fear of us. And it's an interesting role being a state regulator, which is the role to come up to be an 800-pound gorilla to encourage people to come together and give us a better thing, or in what's more comfortable to me personally, should we lay out what we think the right answer is and hope that people will come to the table and say, yeah, that's good, and be more willing to sit down. I'm not sure what the answer is. I'm just more comfortable with trying to figure it out in a way that people can look at and see, and it makes it much easier to do, or more encouraging, at least to me, to do it in the context of myriad state activities, all focused on trying to improve this situation. I'm actually not in the school that thinks it should be one big box. I think multiple efforts going on, not too many, but the fact that there are these multiple efforts going on, including watchdogs like the Delta Vision Foundation, who came out of that wonderful Delta Vision Task Force report to keep us on point, that it's all of the above, not picking winners and losers. It's that we have to deal with all of the multiple beneficial users of water in the Delta, fish and wildlife being a key one that we have to focus on because it's the one we haven't done well enough on, and we've triaged in a way that's just terrible. And we need to figure out how to do it without, while also not destroying the other beneficial uses of ag and urban and recreation and any number of other things, hydro, that are important. So it's an incredibly complex puzzle.
So thanks. So Greg, let me turn to you. I want to actually play off of Tim's warning about the limitations of regulation. When we were doing the research for the PPIC report, one of the things that we frequently heard from water users and other stakeholders was the problem of conflicting and duplicative mandates. And as the Assistant General Manager of Contra Costa Water District, I'm curious whether or not you could give us a couple of examples of, from your perspective, where you actually see some conflicting mandates, and also whether or not we have a process in place right now to help identify and eliminate those conflicts.
Well, the answer to the second part is really no, but I can give you a couple of horror stories. We've got a pipeline that was constructed. It's owned and right-of-way is owned by Reclamation. It was constructed about 40 or 50 years ago that goes through an area that is subject to subsidence. We need to do some work on that, some seismic work. It's about a $1.8 million construction project to put in some valves and do some inspections. Because of the area that it was constructed in, there are wetlands over the pipe, and we need to mitigate for the work we're going to do for that. The area that this is in, this pipeline serves 2 refineries in the city of Martinez, so it's kind of vital, both for the economy of the Bay Area and for the people of Martinez. It's located in an area that's just barely in the jurisdiction of the San Francisco Regional Water Quality Control Board and the San Francisco area for the Corps of Engineers. We can't get them to agree on, we have gotten them to agree, although we objected to it, that the mitigation cannot take place in any area except within their jurisdiction. So, but there's no areas immediately adjacent to it. There are some areas very close to it that could be quite easily used for mitigation, but they're outside of their jurisdictions, and they won't allow it to be done outside of their jurisdictions. We can't get them to agree on the location. We can't get them to agree on the amount of whether it's 1-to-1 or 2-to-1. These aren't very productive or useful wetlands. And so far it's delayed us about 1.5 years, and the mitigation that appears to, but not yet approved by either, appears to cost about $1.3 million for a $1.8 million construction project. It's getting a little bit ridiculous. And for something that's kind of vital for both the industries in the event of an earthquake. That's not the only one. When we were looking at the vote for the Los Vaqueros expansion in 2004, one of the groups that was opposing that, Save Mount Diablo, questioned us about the mitigation measures that we had taken for the original project. They wanted to know about the mitigation lands that we had dedicated and had recorded as easements. We had turned that material over to Fish and Game for their approval, and we're waiting for their approval. It had been 5 years for the Department of Fish and Game to get those approvals done so that we could record those. And their reaction when we told them that was, oh, yeah, that sounds like Fish and Game. They have the same problem because they get lands on that. Well, it's now been 15 years, and we're still waiting for Fish and Game to get that back to us.
Well, Greg, you've never...
Fish and Wildlife.
You should call me.
I'm telling you right now. And that's one thing I would like. They actually are working on it right now because we have a bunch of other mitigation lands we've submitted for easements with the latest expansion on that. But you wouldn't be the first director I've discussed this with.
Well, you could be. I might be the last director you
I hope it is. But on the flip side of that, and that one is really not bothering too much. If you guys don't want it recorded, that's fine, but it's not costing any money. But these others, it does. We've had to put up a letter of credit for them for the price of the land. We've already spent $25 million in land, but we got another letter of credit on that. And that's being delayed by a different problem. And I'm not sure that you can correct this one. And that's just a lack of resources. There you get, and it is true at Fish and Wildlife, California Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, National Marine Fisheries, all these agencies, people in these departments are just overwhelmed. In the case of the other easements we're trying to get recorded and the final approvals on our habitat management plan and our PAR so that we can move forward on the finalization of our mitigation. You have situations in one in particular where we've been working with great people there and working as hard as they can, but one of them got promoted and now she's doing her job, her old job and her new job, and is just overwhelmed. And we understand that. And we see that all the time, that it's not something that's fixable. without more funding. And that funding is just not forthcoming from the legislature. That is a fixable problem, but it is a very difficult problem to work through.
So Chuck, I want to take you out of your current role where you're actually going to solve Greg's problem.
I'd like
put
it
you
before I
back.
retire. You got 3 weeks.
And put you back into, well, the job you had before you took your current position, where you were head of the California wing of Trout Unlimited. And I'm just curious, when you were trying to restore habitat and do things that, that you thought were environmentally beneficial, did you run into the same sort of problems that Greg has run into when he's been trying to actually get infrastructure permitted?
Yes, and I run into frustration like Greg's now as director. So in my prior life, I went through experiences which prove that credo, no good deed goes unpunished. I'll give you an example. So in my last life at Trout Unlimited, a lot of work with timber companies could produce better complex habitat for salmon in coastal streams. A way to do that is to drop trees into a river. Well, I'm also an attorney and understand that you could argue each time you drop a tree on a mile stretch of river is a sequel project, or you could argue the mile's worth of tree dropping is a project. And depending on the answer, you're looking at different permitting approaches. There's a way to solve this stuff, and it's not unlike what Albert Einstein reminded us with his comment that imagination is more important than knowledge, because knowledge kind of tells you all there is to know and understand in the world, whereas imagination allows you to think about everything that might be in the future in the world. So just last session, working with the legislature and then the governor's office, a bill was passed called Assembly Bill 1961. So now for that timber company that wants to do restoration projects in coho country, and if the project itself is kind of compliant with the recovery plans that Mr. Stell's National Marine Fisheries Service has and we have, when they submit the application to us, which would be typically an application for multiple permits, we now have a statutory responsibility to respond within 60 days with a yes or no. And if we provide the permit, it's in lieu of any other permit that would otherwise be required by our department. And the purpose is to expedite restoration projects. But look, this is my first time ever in government. So the number of what the heck moments is really large. So I'll give you a different example in my current role. So we have two different responsibilities. Under the California Endangered Species Act, I think I've got both a legal, but just frankly a moral responsibility to conserve, meaning recover our populations of endangered species. Okay, well, y'all know that sometimes to do a recovery project, you may harm one for the benefit of 99. Well, we have another law, which is called the Fully Protected Species Law. And if you're designated on that list, you can't even look at the species for fear of harming it. It's fully protected. So lo and behold, we have some species which were on both lists, and in one body of law I'm supposed to recover it, which may mean harm one for the benefit of 99, and that other law tells me I can't harm one.
So what do you do?
I start a conversation about how we can be smarter, Lee Majors, $6 million man, how we can be smarter, faster, stronger at these things, and see where the conversation or the debate may go. Sometimes we'll need legislative solutions. Sometimes we have the authority within our own administrative abilities. We just haven't gotten there or refuse to get there. I think the idea of refusing to be better if you're in an agency is passé, and it's just going to pass the problems on to our children. So now's the time.
So Felicia and Tim, any similar experiences to the ones that we've heard about from Greg and Chuck?
Oh, can I take the fifth on that?
Only if Tim gives us an example.
Well, not a specific example, but let me underscore the importance of solving the problem. If we want to live in the world of your first question to Felicia, of expanding, of having comprehensive approaches that have a snowball's chance, at least, of better than a snowball's chance of being successful, we're going to have to spend lots of money, and all these conflicting regulations are part of the risk management problem that Mark was alluding to in the previous panel. And I mean, right now, if you to spend billions to solve problem A with regulatory agency A, and then B can come up later on and undo it all, which is the world we're living in today, that has a real chilling effect on necessary investments to create a better system that creates possibilities for co-equal goals. So as difficult as the problem is, it's a problem that needs to rise to the top of the list, and we need to figure out how we're going to deal with it.
Yeah, I would say too, I'm probably flipping your question, but where I see the problem sometimes is where you do have the individual track silo to solve a problem because of the way a law is written, the way regulations proceed, which can be in conflict with what I'm seeing in a hopeful way in the integrated regional water management planning and other like systems. And our way of dealing with that, for example, in regulation, in our stormwater regs, I'm pretty happy we did this, though we still have to define it, and we'll define it somehow. We'll define it in the course of an appeal on the LA permit, where we could take note of the fact that on the ground, I'll just be LA biased for a moment, but it's happening in other places, you have this incredible movement to deal with flood control, water quality, and water supply, and green space at the same time, while we are working on the water quality side. And so we put in an out to say, if you are working on one of these multi-benefit plans, which is going to take longer and requires a little more time, you're going to have to acquire land, find the right places to do it, we'll cut you some slack. That's the kind of regulatory response in reaction to people coming together that I hope we'll find enough flexibility to do without rendering the objective meaningless. You don't want to create a loophole where nobody has to do anything, but I think we do have to adjust to the changing times where people actually are being very creative in coming up with a better answer, just as I think in the case of permitting, and you may be getting to this, we need to figure out how to move faster on things that actually have obvious benefits for the environment.
Yeah, so
I do have, though, just a comment on the kind of nightmare that's going on with Corps of Engineers and the Regional Water Quality Control Board. It is quite the opposite, though, when we work with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and California Fish and Wildlife in terms of our terrestrial permits. We've been very successful in getting them out together at the same time, both staffs, writing their permits at the same time, even though they have somewhat different statutory requirements and internal requirements. We have been successful in getting them very well coordinated. The main difficulty in doing that, though, is, again, the staffing problem, trying to get a meeting where they can both supply the staff at the same time is usually about a month to a month and a half in the future. So, and subject to at last minute, got to cancel it because somebody had to do something else. And again, that's strictly a funding problem for these organizations.
There may be hope there too, in a certain sense, but not, in my mind, an ultimate outcome. So this may be urban myth, but if I had known before I got the fantastic offer, I might have had a different response. That I'm told our department might be the second biggest licensing and permitting entity in this state behind DMV. So you really can't do much somehow without needing to submit an application and get a permit from our department. And the fact of the matter is, and I've been looking at it hard for about a year and a half, in most of those application sectors, we subsidize the applicant process. And in the last year, because of a couple of, things in the legislature and the governor administration commitment, we're moving a couple of programs to fee-for-service. We issue about up to 1,500 scientific collection permits a year. We also are involved in timber harvest program review, and we do conservation banking mitigation, which is an application. And what we'd spent the last year in each of those sectors discussing with the industry is, would you be willing to pay in more if we could show you our work plan and our capacity need, and that we'll build up the capacity need to shorten a 5-year review timeline into a 50-day, whatever, and make some sort of exchange of consideration to address this kind of core problem. And it appears to have worked last year, and we're now busy prudently kind of building that capacity.
Yeah, we tried that too, and I'm glad to hear that you're having some success on that, because in my view, where it failed with us was really a failure in the higher level management to take that on and make that a priority. And we went through a process where we tried to get a contract with, at that time it was Fish and Game, that we would pay them to hire staff. And it was a nightmare. We got the contract finally out of the legal department. We signed it, we sent it back, and went back to another attorney who started changing the contract that had come initially from Fish and Game, even though we had already signed it and thought it was going to go through. And when it finally got through and everybody had signed it, they had a nightmare going through the legislative process to get the staff and get the funding and the approvals for that. If you can streamline that or set that up as a program and get the management from the top down, that can be successful. And in our case, we ended up getting the permit before that thing was finalized, and in the end didn't need to do that. But having a regular process where you're getting fees for the work that and paying the department for the work that they're doing for you is a good way to go, provided that it goes into a fund that funds you and not into the general fund and funds Lord knows what. And you get the staff out of the legislature that you need.
So following through on this question of the difficulties of getting permits or approval for particular actions, one of the things that the report recommends is the creation of a new entity that's called the Delta Ecosystem Regulatory Coordinator, or DERC, that would sit presumably in the office of the governor and would help to facilitate and coordinate efforts to obtain permits for Delta actions designed to improve the operation of the Delta. And I'm curious, Chuck, as to your reaction. Is that something that would be beneficial, or would it be just another layer of bureaucracy?
I have two reactions. The first is reluctance to miss the opportunity to point out the irony of, not just now, but for quite some time, all of us acknowledging part of the problem is the multiplicity of bureaucracy and entities, and an idea of creating another one.
Yeah, exactly.
That said, I like the idea. I have no comment as to name, an acronym, location, but I like the idea. It's like when you go to a restaurant. To have a good dining experience requires a front of the house, a great chef, but also the often unknown variable of the expediter who's standing there between the kitchen and the front office. We're doing this now on renewable energy. In order to meet our serious, and we will, GHG reduction goals and increase of renewable energy in the state, we're working hard to appropriately permit renewable solar, as an example. And we have an expediter. And many of the involved federal and state agencies meet at a my level or just below kind of standing and literally walk through timelines on projects and when we're going to get them done. It's been helpful. And if you think about some of the necessary commitments to restore the Delta ecosystem, we're going to need to do restoration. We will need to do it faster, better, stronger, smarter. But I'll tell you at the end of the day, Buzz, in my view, we can talk about law and policy a lot. But in my experience, this stuff comes down to sociology, interpersonal dynamics, group dynamics. Relationships really matter. And this is the only thing I'll say, and then I'll get off the stage real quick. It's my monk story. Old monk, new monk are going to market, and they run across an old woman, Old woman says to the old monk, "Can you help me cross the river to get to the other side?" He says, "Of course, climb on my back." They cross. Old monk puts her down. They go different directions. They get about a mile downstream, and the young monk says to the old monk, why did you speak to a stranger? That's a tenet of our religion. You don't do that." Old monk's silent. They go another mile down the road, and young monk says, "Not only did you talk to somebody, you touched a stranger. Incredibly important tenet. Why'd you do that?" Go a third mile down the road, and the young monk says, "I can't believe." And the old monk turns to him and says, "Wait, I put her down 3 miles ago. When are you going to put her down?" And what I find in a lot of our natural resource disputes is, our energy gets moved towards arguing about what's happened in our rearview mirror. It gets moved towards ad hominem attacks. And all of that takes us away from the energy necessary to be creative and solve problems. And I think I have a request for y'all, which I made in front of Tim's membership in this same room yesterday. I think we need all y'all to collectively help us help Californians who are engaged take a deep breath. This is hard stuff. Everyone's very passionate about these issues, but we're all Californians. We ought to stop arguing about who it matters to the most and get about the business of fixing some of these problems.
So I want to actually ask the other panelists
Wait, can I say something about it?
Yeah, but actually before I'm
Okay.
actually so entranced with this notion of the restaurant analogy. My question is there something equivalent to the drink waiter who simply makes you feel good while you're waiting for everything else? Felicia.
I'm scared that that's me. That's why you brought me back, I know. It is. No, I just one thing on that. I should tell you, I like the concept. I think how it needs to be developed. I've been that person in trying to expedite permitting of really hundreds of bond projects down in Los Angeles in the early 90s. And there is something important about having somebody tasked or some group tasked with keeping focus on a given series of projects of whatever kind in a sea of other projects, but also in doing so, they can illuminate what the more systemic problems and fixes are far more effective than every task force that gets put together to look more generally at permitting or an issue. So I like, it gets back to, with Chuck, Chuck does Einstein, he does, whatever. I'm like Yogi Berra said, and people heard me say this at Aqua, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there is. And so having someone figure it out in practice illuminates which issues are more important rather than having methodical minds try to envision every possible thing and trying to reform everything. I just think it works. But I have one key suggestion for all of you. You have got to change the name. It sounds way too much like jerk. That is not going to work. It sounds like other things too. So the name is going to be really important. And whoever it is, they're a border collie. I mean, I love border collies. That's what it's going to take. It just, don't make it too big of a thing that creates its own gravitational sphere. It's got to be the right people tactically applied.
So the Delta Collie? The Delta Collie?
The Delta Collie, yeah. We'll find out there really is a Delta Collie.
But I would say that Chuck, again, is right on one thing. It does take development of relationships. We got our permits, and I'd say the ones that went the fastest were through the State Water Board, where they've focused a lot on administrative permitting rather than getting down to a hearing in the board, and that very much helps. But working collaborative with the staffs really it clears a lot of the issues. And when you're not arguing over what needs to be done, but rather how best to do it, and helping them to the extent that you can grind through the work that they need to do moves it along. And really what you end up with in that kind of situation, the kind of things that we ended up with, is trying to find and get them the priority and the time to do it in where they really are stuck. And you can, I mean, when we were, this was 6 or 7 years ago when we were working on one of our permits for our new intake, just talking to their staff, like, okay, what else are you working on that's slowing you down? And the person came in with a stack of applications like that she had to get done before, and this was in July, before the end of August, because there's a very short window you can work in the water in a number of areas. And all these permits come in at the last minute. And everybody's got to get in there to fix their pier or their pipeline on a stream bed alteration. They all come in at once, and there's just not enough people that are doing this stuff. And you can thoroughly sympathize with the plight that they're in.
So, Tim, let me turn to you before I ask the audience whether they have any questions. Whenever you start talking about multiple stressors, I think one of the things that occurs to people is the possibility of managing them jointly, so that you might, for example, encourage people to address one stressor by promising a little bit more slack on another side if they're willing to focus on the first area. So, for example, you might tell people that if we do more to actually restore the delta, then maybe in return for that we might be able to permit greater exports from the delta. So my question for you is, number one, is this a good policy direction for us to be thinking? And second of all, either now or in the future, are we going to have the science that's really necessary in order to permit that type of trade-off?
Okay, I'll try to remember both parts of your question. First, the audience needs to know there's a certain professional bias to this question. You're an economist in your past, in your training. I'm an economist. Shouldn't there be trade-offs? One economist sends that question to another and you say, duh, of course there should be trade-offs. If you're getting more productivity out of investing in activity A than you are in activity B, shift your resources, move resources over into activity A. It's so common sense to somebody that was trained in economics or who has managed water in this state for the last 30 years. Guess what, though? It doesn't come naturally to the regulatory process. The regulatory process is not trained to think that way. I mean, your specific example is hugely controversial right now, although the whole premise of BDCP is you're not getting much out of your investments in lost water supplies, and if you, other than economic damage, and if you leverage that into things that will have more productivity, we'll have water supply, we'll have better ecosystem outcomes, we'll have more co-equal goals. That's the whole premise, hugely controversial. I think to get where we need to go, the regulatory community needs to go through something like what the water community has gone through in the last 20 years. And I'm hugely encouraged by the regulatory leadership. I don't want to condemn you with this, but that's sitting up here at this table, who remind me a little bit that there's maybe the potential to be, there's a couple of Carl Bronques sitting here. Felicia, you remember Carl. Most of you in the audience don't know who Carl Bronque is, but let me tell just a quick story to drive a point home. The Peripheral Canal went down in 1982. One of the few people who understood the importance and what that meant was Carl. He became the general manager of the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California in 1984. One of the first things he did was to push aside a man named Don Brooks. Don was a wonderful man, but he was a registered engineer, heart and soul state water project. He had been part of that community that built the vision of complete the state water project. That was the water plan for Southern California. And here is this very revered engineer being moved to the side, and he retired shortly thereafter. And who did Bronque bring in? He brought in a man named Wiley Horn to be the chief of planning, and Felicia knew Wiley Horn as well. Wiley was not a registered engineer. Wiley had a PhD in water resources modeling of some sort from North Carolina State. He wasn't the import water guy. He worked for the Los Angeles County Public Works, and his specialty was, guess what? Recycling water, was local resource development. Here was a dramatic change in leadership accompanied by a dramatic change in direction from the top. Bronque was a visionary, and he meant it. You were going in a different direction. It took 10 years to stop giving the Complete the State Water Project speech. But in the regulatory community, there's still a version of that complete something that you were thinking of 25 years ago. We haven't had that change in culture, that change in leadership. I think it's essential to get us the kind of trade-offs you're talking about. If we don't start trading off between our investments and the stressors, we're going to wind up with economic mush and very high cost for very little gain in a lot of things, and it'll be impossible to put the relationship together. So I have a specific recommendation to Chuck and to Felicia. Be a little bit like Carl. Despite what others might think of that wondrous man, he taught a lot of us a lesson about how you induce dramatic change. And we're certainly at another time when we need that kind of dramatic change.
So Felicia, probably one of the most famous things that the State Water Resources Control Board has done in recent years is Appendix K to the San Joaquin River decision. So is that an example of something that we could be using more broadly to enable these type of trade-offs? And you probably need to explain to most people what Appendix K is.
Appendix K is a restatement. If you look at earlier water quality control plans, it's not novel. I mean, especially you could look at the water quality control plan that never saw the light of day, which was, well, it saw the light of day, but which ended up not being adopted, and then EPA got sued and we set the water quality standards. But it's the program of implementation in our water quality control plans frequently does talk about other stressors. I think what we're committed to doing this time, we haven't even yet in Appendix K, but we're having conversations with our fellow agencies about predation and other things, is to figure out how to do, in some ways, some of the things that you're talking about and the Delta Council is talking about with the council, which we'll participate in fully, but to figure out how to have that more baked and more sure. Some people have even come to us and suggested that we use a provision of Porter Cologne, which I just reread this morning, actually, 13247, right? Thank you. 13247, which has people shuddering, because in theory it says we could put whatever we wanted in a water quality control plan, and other agencies have to abide by it. It's not different from the consistency provision, but it's of a piece, or they have to tell us why they don't have to. Not just they don't want to, but why they don't have to. So there are mechanisms there, but what we're trying to do is to take what have been paragraphs in our programs of implementation in the past and add more beef, or add more whatever your substance is that makes you feel better, but add more substance to them. I've just been around too many vegetarians. I guess I'm guilty about my bacon habit. So how do you, how do we make that more robust so that it's more real? I do want to say something, though, about what Tim said about the trade-offs. I mean, this is also a where's the beef point, which is we have to create mechanisms, and this is going back to your very first panel, we have to figure out how to have robust enough science and how to figure out how to do adaptive management in a changing world so we can see if one of those things is actually making a difference where we can do a trade-off. Because it's been faith-based in the past, and that's where a lot of the rhetoric is, and we can't do that. There's too much at stake. That said, going back to your first panel, there is an incredible amount of work going on to figure out how do we make adaptive management work in a way that has credibility and integrity, so that we can make those trade-offs legitimately and make the smartest, most cost-effective decisions work. Because I'm agreeing with Tim here, we can't do everything. And we have to figure out, like the $6 million man, how to be smarter about how we do things. But that requires science, data, and delivery on whether it's more fish or whatever your indicator is.
Very briefly, that takes you back to the science part of your question that I did not address. One of the phrases that struck me in the PPIC report, it talked about the importance of science broadly accepted. I think that was the phrase. That's important, not just science, but science that people are willing to buy into and make decisions on. We don't have that today. We've got too much combat science. We're all contaminated by years of adversarial relationships with each other. I think we should seriously explore this idea of a joint powers authority for science, where the scientists don't work for any of the combatants, including, by the way, the regulatory agencies. They work for a commonality that would separate them from the adversarial process. That or something like that, I think, is an ideal well worth exploring.
Hey, so, you know, in the spirit of a healthy debate, Tim, I would just reject the premise that the regulatory structure doesn't allow, you know, for creativity or flexibility or trade-off. I actually think the regulatory structure is just a thing. It's the people who are trying to figure out how to shape the permitting and the decision-making within the regulatory structure, which may be the issue. Second, I would encourage us to take the concept of trade-off and turn it into a different concept, which I'm personally very interested in exploring. Let's figure out how to do performance-based permitting. You know, if over a defined time frame, based on specific metrics which are actionable, relevant to the problem, measurable, we're either achieving it or not. The achievement or not what triggers flexibility and the trade-offs. And that's what those of us who've been in the private sector go through when you do a work plan. You do performance reviews, you figure out what your performance-based outcomes are, and you judge against them.
Yeah, the other thing, you mentioned something that triggered a thought that I think that would be helpful, and that is permitting by regulation to the extent you can. Every project is treated as unique, and that requires a thorough analysis on each project, but not all of them are. A lot of them are very, very similar, and if you can take like NPDES nationwide permits or and take a class of them and stick them on a side and say, you're in that class, you do these things, you're done, here's your permit. You can get 401 permits very, very quickly for construction projects through the regional board because they do that. But the ones that are complex, then you have the time to learn, for the staff to learn about them and figure out what needs to be done.
I mean, that's the holy grail, right? That's the right combination of standardization and flexibility.
Right.
We've been doing a lot of those too, so at the state level.
Okay, thanks. So Felicia's last sort of full comments brought up bacon, beef, lettuce, and with all of that in mind, it's time actually for lunch. So rather than taking questions at this point, what I would suggest is I'm just going to turn things over to Ellen to conclude things, but then we'll take our break for lunch, and hopefully the panelists will stick around for a while. You have an opportunity to ask them questions at the end of this particular panel. But I want, before handing things over to Ellen, have you thank the panelists for this discussion.
So I'm going to add my thanks to this panel and the two before and to all of you for sticking with us. Lunch is right outside. Come hang out, talk, enjoy, and please fill out your evaluation forms, including the quiz about how all of the different state and federal agencies currently coordinate. Thank you so much, and enjoy.
Thanks.